is a combination of online and in-person.
Hello?
In person in Melbourne, and I believe in Sydney. There's some people in person gathered there as well. So I'd first like to start by acknowledging that tonight we're standing on stolen land, land of various nations, because this is a Zoom call with people zooming in from all over. Where I'm sitting at the moment is Wurundjeri land, land of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people. So I'd certainly like to acknowledge that this is stolen land and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. So just to give people a bit of a sense of the structure of the forum, we're going to have speakers and then we're going to go into general discussion and questions and so forth. There's a slight reordering of the order of our speakers because one of our speakers has been in a slight accident a little bit earlier. So we're going to start off with Jacob Andrewartha, who's the co-convener of Melbourne Socialist Alliance. He's also active in the refugee rights and anti-racism and public housing campaigns, as well as around climate issues. Then we were going to next have Marianne Mackay, who's a Noongar activist from Western Australia, involved in many campaigns from campaigns against police violence, for Aboriginal sovereignty, against uranium mining and for refugee rights. Marianne is also the lead upper house candidate for Socialist Alliance Western Australia in the Southern Metropolitan seat. Now, Marianne is a person who's just had an accident, a car accident, but she is keen to participate as soon as she's dealt with that issue. So maybe it was a minor accident. So she asked if she could speak last. So we might even have to have some general discussion after our other speakers before Marianne comes on, but there's also a possibility she might not be able to join us. Then our third speaker is Lavanya Thavaraja, who is a Tamil activist with the Tamil Refugee Council and the Migrant Workers Centre, which means she's involved in many campaigns to organise migrant workers for their rights, against wage theft, against racism, and taking up a myriad of issues that people are confronted with. So we'll have our speakers, then we'll have discussion. So the speakers will probably speak for around 10 to 15 minutes each. And then I'll explain how the discussion will work afterwards. So our first speaker will be Jacob Andrewartha. Take it away, Jacob.
Thanks for that. So I guess to start off, I would like to just acknowledge that we are meeting on stolen land. For me, it's the land of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, and sovereignty has never been ceded. And when it comes to the issues that we are discussing at this forum, it is important to really note that we cannot really resolve the issues of systematic racism in this country or of racial oppression without achieving full justice and sovereignty for First Nations. And I guess part of what my sort of presentation is really wanting to sort of set a bit of context for this kind of discussion, because one of the reasons we organised this forum was in response to a whole range of kind of issues. We saw the kind of massive kind of Invasion Day protests that happened on January 26, which continues to be bigger and bigger every year. Although this, and in fact, one of the amazing things about the Invasion Day protests this year was it was in the context of the fact that there was no Australian Day ceremony. And in some sense, we're essentially winning that cultural war against the right. And of course, there has been the ongoing struggle to free the refugees imprisoned in the Park Hotel, which, has had a partial victory. But of course, that victory hasn't been accompanied with a dismantling of the mandatory detention kind of regime. And I think, we thought it would be good to have a discussion on where we think the roots of where racism comes from and how we can resist. Now, racism generally kind of assumes that separate races of people exist with clearly kind of definable sets of social and physical characteristics and asserts that some of these races are superior to others. But I think one of the issues, obviously, with this is that biology cannot provide coherent definitions of what we usually identify as races. Isolated genetic pools are... biology cannot provide coherent definitions of what are usually identified as races. Of course, isolated genetic pools are rare in reality and don't form the basis for racial categories in practice. Even if generally consistent physical features discernible, they bear no real significance because social traits are not attached to skin or eye colour or the shape of the nose. Now, I guess one of the sort of contexts, to start off, this discussion, those who have probably been following the AFL are probably aware of this whole saga engulfing the Collingwood Football Club in response to the Collingwood Football Club Do Better report. And this has kind of been revealing of the many incidents of systematic racism within the club. And what's worse, the report found that incidences of racism with the club were met with defensive reactions, basically refusing to acknowledge the impact of racism on the victims. And of course, I think we have to give a bit of tribute to the fact that there were of the efforts of many brave players, such as Nicky Winmar, Michael Long, Adam Goods, Joel Wilkinson, who really, it was through their efforts of standing up against this racial abuse that this report was even released and it's even seen in the media. And I think one of the kind of lessons about the story, of course, I know as I was writing this talk, Eddie Maguire hadn't actually resigned, but now he has resigned. But I think the story in terms of what I wrote here is pretty much the same. He's really, in a sense, escaping any real sense of responsibility of perpetrating racial abuse, or really, in some sense, he's not really facing any real consequences. And I think one of the amazing kind of things about this incident is even the kind of media is refusing to call it out for what it is. In fact, a lot of the kind of characterizations of Eddie Maguire is that he's just a buffoon, he's just a silly man, or comes from an old time. They're not actually calling him out for actually being racist at all, which I think is a real problem. Now, this is kind of like just one of the many kind of recent examples of racism that we find expressed through the institution of sports. But more than that, we find racial oppression and racism to be really present in all aspects of our political system. Through the torture of refugees on offshore detention camps, the drumming up of Islamophobia in the name of national security, to the genocidal policies that continue to dispossess the First Nations community. And of course, racial oppression extends to more than just the enacted policies of our politicians. It is ever present in all aspects in our society. It is often reinforced and pushed by the corporate media. And of course, it's reflected in the kind of unequal access to resources such as housing and healthcare. But I guess when it comes to how we explain these instances of racism, those in power often try to explain it as the failing of the individual, a case of prejudice, or in the case of their outright racist policies, such as their refugee policy, it is often justified under the goals of national security, defending the border regime, or even worse, you can often see that the often explanation, the often justification that politicians put for racist policies can often be as basic as they justify it on the basis of the fact that their electorate happens to be racist. And of course, I think we should sort of reject those kind of explanations that try to blame voters for the fact that the government implements racist policies, because really the government has a material interest in supporting racist kind of policies. And I think one of the kind of things about what we've been wanting to talk about here is racism in all its forms is not necessarily just the result of prejudice. It has systematic roots that go back to the development of capitalism, the economic system that really dominates and governs our lives. And of course, capitalism being an economic system that relies on the accumulation of profit for private owners, for capitalism to be profitable on a worldwide scale, the ideology of racism was central to its expansion in history. Because while racism and colonialism predates the development of capitalism, it was the system of capitalism that reinforced these ideologies because it served the economic interests and the global expansion of capital. Whether entire populations of people being systematically subjugated, whether it is done in order to clear people from their lands that are rich in natural resources, or even to justify poor working conditions for different sections of society. We can see this kind of trend of capitalism throughout the world using racism to justify policies which undermine solidarity between workers or to pursue profit at the expense of ordinary people's interests and the environment. And I think going into the really specific example of where we find ourselves in so-called Australia, I think it's important to really note that the economic development of this country is bound up with racism and racist ideology from those in power. And of course, it all started when the first fleet sailed into Port Jackson on January 26, 1788, which signalled the beginning of the dispossession and super exploitation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. The genocide of the First Nations was justified on the basis of ideology by the colonialists known as terra nullius, based not only just on this sort of racial divide of racial superiority, but on the distinction between civilization, essentially meaning private property, and savagery, absence of private property. And of course, this was the ideology that shaped the landscape of the colonial settler state that became known as Australia. But of course, it was more than just an ideology that shaped the political landscape. It played a particular economic role in terms of laying the basis for capital accumulation and the development of modern day capitalism in Australia. And of course, the descendants and the benefactors of this early sort of capital accumulation and development led to the establishment of powerful pastoral agribusinesses and mining monopolies that still have a great deal of power and influence over our political system today. You just have to look at how, who's actually in power. Like, for example, the Nationals still wield a significant amount of power. Then, of course, you have the likes of Clive Palmer. And then, of course, you have the fact that all the major parties, from Labor to Liberal, are completely wedded into appealing to these mining monopolies. And, of course, this is also evident in how Australia continues to be the domain of mining projects that have really the aim of dispossessing what remains of the First Nations community off their land and denying them rights, despite this growing movement for sovereignty for Aboriginal people and their proud ongoing resistance to colonialism. And of course, going back a bit into kind of history, in this kind of period, I guess, of the early stages of capitalist development, we often started to see an expansion of primary industries in the 1800s. And of course, this is where we started to see other forms of racial oppression start to develop. And of course, it started off with Australia importing indentured Chinese, Indian and Kanake labourers, replacing European convicts. And of course, this was lauded by, rural employers associations and colonial politicians who really praised this as being, because of the low levels of sustenance needed by such workers, this was seen as like a boost. But of course, later on, what happened is during the Gold Rush period, which attracted large numbers of Chinese immigrants, these waves of Chinese immigrants threatened white colonialists with economic competition in comparison to their indentured predecessors. And of course, this was in the period that anti-Chinese racism in Australian history was adopted, because basically in response to this economic competition, it was threatening the profits of a growing Australian capitalist class. And of course, what the governments did kind of in response to this was really they kind of laid the basis for the white Australian policy. But of course, it was started off with the settler state adopting all sorts of exclusionary policies that exclude people on the basis of race. And of course, you can kind of see kind of like the roots of kind of this history in terms of what we kind of even see in contemporary times. We have this kind of drumming up of hysteria against China in relation to this so-called trade war between the United States and China. And then you all have all these sort of discussions about who is, Australian capital, or China, your thing is made in China, you need to have your thing made in Australia, etc. I mean, all those kind of things those kind of tropes that we sort of often see in the kind of media, they are in some sense, they have a certain level of continuity with how racism was enacted in Australia. And of course, I think when we look at the history of racism globally in history, there's often very much a real link between racial and oppression and the accumulation of capital. Just look at thinking about, the whole transnational slave trade in many parts of the world. But of course, Australia very much has a similar context in history. And of course, even things like, which might not seem apparent, even the things like the policy of offshore detention often have an economic basis that's tied up with capitalism, because those in power have a material interest in militarizing the borders of their nation state to control who comes here and under what circumstances they come. And often, of course, the control of border is really, the controls of borders is often tied up with the control of which labour is allowed to come and which is not. And of course, we have from the white Australian policy in the early 20th century to the stolen generations to the detention regime of refugees, the settler state of Australia has always been profoundly racist, and the origins really come down to its genocidal foundations. And because of this, even the question of Australian nationalism in a national identity is often based on racism, even of course it might not seem obviously overtly so, but I think it comes down really to kind of the foundations. And of course, this is how the Australian nationalism is often used to divide and rule, like who's considered worthy of being Australian and who's often not. And of course, often within Australia today, we kind of see this, the kind of worst excesses of racism is often directed against those who don't fit within the Australian national identity. And of course, there's often pushes for those who don't to assimilate and pledge unwavering allegiance to the Australian national state. Yet, coincidentally, it is often the most marginalised within capitalism that often find it hardest to become members of the Australian national identity, and that has to do with how our system is deliberately designed. Even today, racism as ideology lives on, continues to justify continuing racial oppression, institutionalised inequality based on racial crime. Contemporary forms of racial oppression that exist, which I won't go necessarily into all because I'm running low on time, such as discriminatory employment, channeling certain groups in the lowest paid, least secure job, scapegoating for the capitalist class, black thefts in custody. And of course, racism also plays a part in Australians' capital role in the exploitation and theft of mineral and energy resources from sovereign nations in the South Pacific today. And of course, we see that this ongoing role of racism as enacted by governments gives rise to far-right forces such as One Nation and the United Patriots Front. And I think given racism, to really conclude, given racism and its systematic links to our own economic system, any anti-racism campaign cannot simply just appeal to education or appeals for tolerance. Often politicians will resort to these means as a solution to dealing with racism in our society. But to be effective anti-racist, we have to start with opposing the actual racist policies that are being carried out daily by our governments, starting with the denial of land rights for First Nations, discrimination in employment, racist law employment, the restrictions on the rights of migrants, and so on. And of course, at the same time, racism is often very used as a weapon to divide and rule, and by thus who wield power in society. And the only way that we can overcome this is through building independent mass mobilisations that bring people together and build solidarity amongst the oppressed. And of course, more than that, those who are at the margins of the capitalist system and the impact and are impacted racism have to be empowered to be part of this fight back against the rich and powerful. And of course, this is why the left should always openly challenge racism and racist ideology within our campaigning groups, because the impacts of racism limits the involvement of those most impacted by it in the political struggle. And of course, the issue of racism cannot necessarily be completely resolved until we deal with the capitalist system, because capitalism is built on the oppressive social relations that undermine racism and be the rule of ever-shrinking but increasingly milking rule. It needs to divide the majority in order to continue its rule, and to do this, it has to perpetuate racism and national chauvinism. And of course, to overcome this, we need to fight for a society that is driven by human need and not that of the profits for the rich and the powerful.
Thanks heaps for that, Jacob. I might try and fix the speaker view. So we'll go straight into our second speaker, who will be Lavanya Thavaraja. from the Migrant Workers Centre and Tamil Refugee Council. So welcome, Lavanya.
Hello, everyone. I'll also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, their leaders past, present, and emerging. This land was stolen and never ceded, and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to start by with a question. So, can we challenge racism without challenging the current system? So, racism is fundamentally about it's people would say it's fundamentally about individual behavior, but I would like to argue that it is not that true. Although often that's how people experience it. It has been built into the institutions of Australian capitalism from its origins in invasion, dispossession, and genocide against the First Nation population. For example, even if by some miracle, every individual races change their views, the major forms of racist disadvantage that Aboriginal people experience, from appallingly low life expectancy to the worst housing, worst education, ill health, joblessness, and access to government services, would go on. Nor would the extra attention that they receive from government, the murderous police, jails, courts, and child removal departments would disappear. This racism is a central part to capitalism because the system that benefits from racism is capitalism. It's a process of divide and rule. Establishing division within the working class is a fundamental to ruling class attempt to keep control over the society, in which they constitute only in tiny minority and making the profits from the labors of the majority. Constructing an enemy is also important for prosecuting imperialist wars. This also explains why the targets of Australian racism have shifted over the decades, depending on the needs of the ruling class at the time to time. When the White Australia policy was introduced in 1901, most Chinese workers suffered. Most of you would have known how the Italians have been targeted in late 19th century. Today, it's First Nations, Muslims, Africans, and refugees who are the prime targets of anti-migrant racism. Vilifying these groups to justify Australia's involvement in occupation and war has resulted in the anti-terror legislation that has strengthened the state's power to spy and intimidate. If the refugees can be imprisoned and brutalized, so too can poor and workers too. Racism is not purely for a social phenomenon. It has a specific economic use. Society in which racism is more pronounced have in general low wages and poorer working conditions. For example, in the US South, historical divisions between Black and white workers created downward pressure on wages for all the workers and have contributed to the confidence of the bosses to ruthlessly exploit both Black and white workers. To this day, workers in US South are most poorly unionized and low paid in the country. Of the 5 United States, there are no minimum wage laws. All are located in South. This is not a product of retrograde views of your average racist, but a legacy of slavery, segregation, and the prevalence of racism that has weakened the workers' movement and held down working conditions. Those on precarious visa toil in some of the most exploited industry in the country. As an organizer from Migrant Workers Center, I have witnessed so many refugees, asylum seekers, backpackers, international students have been paid very less than the minimum wage. And they are subjected to intimidation. They are sacked if they spoke up or joined union and under constant threat of deportation. Racism and national borders makes this situations possible. It's a windfall for bosses, but it's a disaster for all the working class people, both migrant workers and those struggling to defend hard-won gains. It's a structural element that links racism and capitalism, and over which most people absolutely have no control. But it does not necessarily mean people will swallow everything and anything that is spoon-fed to them. In recent years, there has been mounting opposition to Australia Day, with tens and thousands of marching for Invasion Day rallies. Educating some people would not address or would not challenge the racism at all. It won't build houses for poor people. It won't give jobs for many workers. But organizing workers to overcome racial division and stand together against their bosses and government is what helps sideline racist ideas. It is not an accident that high points of anti-racist struggle in Australia have coincided with the upsurges in the struggle in which workers most unclearly see that the boss are their real enemies and only the racism that undermines their struggle as working class. After all, working class is multiracial and multi-ethnic, and our strength is our unity. This is how we can overcome racism and the system that perpetuates it, a system which money and power matter more than human lives. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks heaps for that, Lavanya. I think those are two great talks to launch us into discussion. Now, I have a feeling Marianne won't be available yet to join us. Just checking with no, yeah. So I think she's preoccupied because of her car accident. So I'd like to open up the floor for discussion. But before I do that, I'd like to make just a few announcements just for people to know what's happening. Firstly, I'd like to say that this is the 30th anniversary of Green Left Weekly this year. So this forum has been hosted by Socialist Alliance and Green Left Weekly. Green Left Weekly started coming out on the 18th of February during the first Gulf War, when that huge alliance of countries invaded and killed tens or hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. And then later on, there was a second Iraq invasion, which did similar. So so Green Left Weekly was born of the struggle and is still going. And I'd like to urge people to consider becoming a supporter of Green Left Weekly or Green Left. And Chloe is going to post the link to become a supporter. You can just become a supporter for $5 a month if you just want a digital access to Green Left Weekly, but then there are other rates for getting the print edition sent out to you, or a solidarity rate, which helps us to provide Green Left to all sorts of people who can't afford necessarily a supportership. Secondly, I'd like to ask people if they'd like to find out a little bit more about Socialist Alliance. Socialist Alliance organises many different campaigns and activities, and we also run Introduction to Socialism and Introduction to Marxism discussions. In Melbourne, our next Introduction to Socialism series will be on Saturday, the 20th of February at 11 a.m. Chloe has just put in the link to Socialist Alliance where you can sign up to our newsletter. In Melbourne branch, we send out a fortnightly calendar of upcoming events. And then lastly, I'd like to announce a rally, which is also very, very important rally, titled Let Them Out, Let Them Stay, Free the Medevac Refugees. This is really important. We have had a victory, not a full victory. We've managed to release over 60 refugees from hotel detention. These are medevac refugees who were on Nauru or Manus for almost 8 years, were brought to Australia because they had such serious medical conditions they couldn't, and they were not allowed access to treatment, or there weren't the services available for treatment on Nauru and Manus. They were brought to Australia, then stuck straight in hotel detention. And in a lot of cases, they never received the treatment. And in fact, in some cases, people had war shrapnel as a result of the military onslaught against the Tamil people, the Tamil the genocide in 2009. Some people have still got shrapnel in their bodies, including their brain, as a result of that war, and the Australian government has not provided medical treatment. So there's going to be a rally to free the remaining Medivac refugees from the Park Hotel and MITA in Melbourne. It'll be at 2 p.m. From State Library, and then we'll have a few speakers and we'll march to the Park Hotel, where we can see and communicate with the refugees who are still stuck inside. There'll also be a protest happening on the same day in Adelaide on the steps of Parliament House at 2 p.m. and there are daily protests happening in Darwin. I can't remember what time that is, but if you've got friends in Darwin or Adelaide, let them know about the protests. So I'll now open up for discussion. If people want to say something, put your name in the chat, and I'll take a call list. So and for people in the Melbourne office, Melbourne venue, you'll have to come up here so that people online can hear you. Okay. And for people in Sydney, you'll need to go up to the microphone there so that people online can hear you. Now, I think Marianne has just joined us. I'm not sure if you're ready to speak, Marianne. If you're ready to speak, come online. But if you feel like you want to ease your way into discussion and listen to some of the discussion first, that's also fine as well. Is Marianne there?
Yeah, I've just walked in the door, so I'll just be a couple of minutes if that's okay, get a coffee. And
do you want to wait a little bit? We'll have a couple of questions and comments. And yeah, no, that'd be fine. Ease your way into it all. And so we'll start some discussion. And of course, there are lots of issues which have been raised in the two talks, but also, you know, it's a limit to what you can cover in a 15-minute talk. So there are plenty of points also which haven't